Jack had always been the golden child in his parents' eyes. From a young age, he had excelled in school, was the first to attend a prestigious university, and later built a successful career as a lawyer. His siblings, Mark and Lisa, had taken different paths. Mark ran a small auto repair shop, and Lisa worked as a school teacher. Their parents had always been proud of Jack's accomplishments, but none of them ever expected that their admiration for him would have such serious consequences. When their parents passed away within a year of each other, first their mother from a sudden stroke, then their father from complications after surgery, the three siblings were left to mourn. The loss was painful, but they found some comfort in the belief that their parents had loved them all equally. It wasn't until the reading of the will that their grief turned into something. Jack had arrived at the lawyer's office that afternoon, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. The estate was sizable, but he assumed it would be divided fairly among the three of them. Mark and Lisa were already there when he walked in, sitting stiffly across from Mr. Reynolds, their family's longtime attorney. The air was heavy with unspoken words. "Thank you for coming," Mr. Reynolds said as he adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the thick folder in front of him. "I know this is a difficult time for all of you." They nodded in response. "I'll get straight to the point. Your parents left behind a formal will that outlines their wishes regarding their estate. According to their instructions, the bulk of their savings, properties, and investments, amounting to approximately $10 million, will be inherited by Jack." The room fell silent. Jack blinked, certain he had misheard. Mark let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm sorry, what?" Lisa looked between the lawyer and Jack, her face pale. "You're saying they left everything to him?" Mr. Reynolds hesitated for a second before nodding. "Yes, there are small personal items allocated to each of you, some sentimental belongings, family heirlooms, but the financial assets and real estate holdings have been left entirely to Jack." Jack's mouth went dry. His mind raced as he struggled to process the words. He hadn't asked for this. He had never even discussed inheritance with his parents, let alone expected to receive such a fortune while his siblings got nothing. Mark shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. "That doesn't make sense. Why would they do that?" "I can only share what was written in the will," Mr. Reynolds said. "Your parents were clear in their decision." Jack could feel the weight of his siblings' eyes on him. He wanted to say something, to tell them that this was just as shocking to him as it was to them. But nothing came out. Lisa finally broke the silence. "Is there a letter? A note? Anything explaining their reasoning?" Mr. Reynolds nodded and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "There is a letter addressed to Jack, but I believe it provides some insight into their decision." He handed it over carefully, and Jack took it with trembling hands. He unfolded the paper and began to read aloud. "Dearest Jack, we have always been proud of you. Your achievements, your dedication, and your hard work have been a source of joy for us. Over the years, we have watched you build a life of success, and we know that you will use what we leave behind wisely. We trust you to honor our legacy and to carry forward the values we have always held dear. You have been our greatest pride, and we want you to have the security and stability that this inheritance can provide." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His parents' love was evident in every line, but so was their favoritism. They hadn't left anything to Mark and Lisa because they believed he, Jack, was the one who deserved it. Mark stood up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "Unbelievable," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "So that's it? We don't even matter?" Lisa wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. "This isn't fair." Jack felt sick. I didn't know about this," he said quickly. "I swear I had no idea." "That doesn't change anything," Mark snapped. "You get $10 million, and we get a few trinkets? How is that supposed to be okay?" "I don't think that's what Mom and Dad meant," Jack insisted. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Lisa looked at him, her face filled with a pain that cut deep. "Do you even think They loved us the same. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The reality was staring them all in the face. Their parents hadn't loved them equally, not when it came down to actions. Mark let out a bitter laugh. Guess we know who the favorite really was. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat awkwardly. If you wish to contest the will, there are legal avenues. I don't even know if I want to contest it, Lisa whispered. I just want to understand why they did this. Jack looked down at the letter in his hands, feeling its weight as if it were made of stone. His entire life he had worked hard to make his parents proud. But now he realized that their admiration had come at a cost, one that had left his siblings out in the cold. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if their approval had been a blessing or a curse. Jack had spent the past few weeks living in a strange fog, caught between guilt and disbelief. The fallout from the will reading had been worse than he could have imagined. Mark refused to answer his calls, and Lisa's messages had become short and distant. His once closer family had fractured overnight, and Jack wasn't sure how to fix it. The inheritance sat untouched in his account. He couldn't bring himself to spend a dime of it. Every time he considered it, he saw Mark's anger, Lisa's hurt expression, and the lingering weight of his parents' letter. They had meant well, at least he hoped they had, but their decision had left nothing but resentment in its wake. One evening, as Jack sat in his office staring at his untouched financial statement, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and was surprised to see a name he hadn't expected. Grandpa Walter. His grandfather was a quiet man, someone who had always been present but never intrusive. He was the type to observe rather than interfere, speaking only when he felt it was necessary. For most of Jack's life, Walter had been a steady, if distant, figure, a man who had survived the Great Depression, built a modest fortune through hard work, and lived by a strict moral code. Jack hesitated before answering. "Grandpa?" "Jack." His grandfather's voice was calm, but there was a weight to it. "I'd like to come by and see you. We need to talk." Jack's stomach tightened. There was no mistaking the seriousness in Walter's tone. "Of course. When?" "I'm outside." Jack froze. His grandfather had never been one for long-winded explanations. He got straight to the point. Without another word, Jack stood up and walked to the door, opening it to find Walter standing on the front porch, his hands resting on his cane. His expression was unreadable. "Come in," Jack said quickly, stepping aside. Walter entered without hesitation, moving with surprising steadiness for a man in his 80s. He took a seat in the living room, glancing around at Jack's house, the expensive furniture, the polished wood floors, the framed degrees on the wall. "Nice place," Walter said. "Thanks." Jack sat across from him, feeling suddenly like a child again, waiting to be scolded. "What's this about?" Walter let out a slow breath, tapping his cane against the floor. "It's about the inheritance, about your parents' decision." Jack tensed. "I didn't ask for it, Grandpa. I didn't know they would do this." "I know," Walter said simply, "but that doesn't change what happened." Jack rubbed a hand over his face. "I don't know what you want me to do. Mark and Lisa hate me. They think I had something to do with it, but I didn't. I don't even know why Mom and Dad made that choice." Walter studied him for a long moment. "Do you think it was right?" Jack hesitated. The truth was, he wasn't sure. Part of him wanted to believe his parents had their reasons, that their decision wasn't meant to hurt anyone. But another part of him couldn't ignore the unfairness of it. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't think they meant to hurt Mark and Lisa, but it wasn't fair. They worked hard, too. They deserved something." Walter nodded slowly. "Your parents were good people, but they made a mistake." Jack's breath caught. It was the first time anyone in the family had said it so plainly. "You think so?" "I know so." Walter's gaze was unwavering. "Your mother and father loved you, Jack. but they confused love with admiration. They saw your success and mistook it for worthiness. That was their failing, not yours. Jack swallowed hard. He had spent his entire life chasing his parents' approval, but he had never thought of it that way. Had they really loved him more, or had they simply valued what he had achieved more? "I don't know what to do," Jack admitted. "Mark and Lisa won't even talk to me." Walter leaned forward slightly. "Then you make it right." Jack frowned. "How? I can't change the will." "You don't need to change the will," Walter said. "You need to change what happens next." Jack looked at him, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Walter tapped his cane again, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to keep the money." Jack blinked. "You think I should just give it away?" "I think you should do what's right," Walter said. "Your parents made a decision, but that doesn't mean you have to follow it. You have the power to fix this." Jack leaned back, his mind racing. He had been so focused on defending himself, on insisting that he wasn't responsible for his parents' actions, that he had never considered that he could change things. The money was his now. He could do whatever he wanted with it. Walter must have seen the conflict in his eyes because he softened slightly. "Jack, money doesn't just disappear. It moves. You decide where it moves." Jack exhaled slowly. "Even if I wanted to split it with them, I don't know if they'd accept it." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe not right away, but it's not just about the money, Jack. It's about what it represents. Your parents took something from them, whether they meant to or not. If you want to fix things, you have to give them back more than just money. You have to give them back their place in the family." Jack stared at his grandfather, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just about numbers in a bank account. It was about trust, about repairing the bond that had been broken. For the first time since the will reading, he felt like he had a choice. Walter stood up, adjusting his coat. "Think about it." Jack stood as well, still processing everything. "Grandpa, why do you care so much?" Walter looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Because I made my own mistakes once, and I'd like to see one less in this family." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving Jack standing in the middle of the room, the weight of the inheritance heavier than ever. Jack spent the next few days unable to think about anything other than his grandfather's words. The money didn't have to stay where it was. It could move. And more importantly, it wasn't just about the money, it was about the damage that had been done. He had spent so much time defending himself, insisting he had done nothing wrong, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. His siblings felt betrayed. Whether or not he had been at fault, their pain was real, and if he ever wanted to fix things, he had to start by acknowledging that. But reaching out was easier said than done. Mark had ignored every call and text since the will reading, and Lisa had only responded with short, polite messages that barely acknowledged him. Jack wasn't sure if she was trying to keep the peace or if she simply didn't know what to say. Either way, he knew he couldn't just send a message asking if they wanted a share of the inheritance. It wasn't about handing over a check. It was about trust. On Saturday morning, after a sleepless night spent going over his options, he decided to go to the auto shop. Mark had taken it over from their uncle years ago and had built it into a successful small business, though it had never made him rich. Jack had rarely visited. His career as a lawyer had taken him in a very different direction, but he knew Mark was always there on weekends. As he pulled into the lot, he spotted Mark under the hood of a car, his back turned. There were a few other mechanics working in the shop, but Jack barely noticed them. His pulse quickened as he stepped out of his car, suddenly uncertain of what he was going to say. Mark must have sensed someone approaching because he straightened up and turned around. His expression shifted the moment he saw Jack, his jaw tightening. "What are you doing here?" Mark asked flatly, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. Jack exhaled slowly. I wanted to talk. Mark let out a short, humorless laugh. Oh yeah? About what? The $10 million you inherited while Lisa and I got nothing? Because I think we already covered that. Jack hesitated, then shook his head. Not about the money. About us. Mark scoffed, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. There is no us, Jack. You made that pretty clear when you walked out of that lawyer's office with everything while Lisa and I got a couple of old family trinkets. I didn't ask for it, Jack said, frustration creeping into his voice. I didn't even know Mom and Dad made that decision. Mark's expression darkened. Yeah, well, you sure didn't seem too eager to do anything about it. Jack clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to stay calm. That's why I'm here. I am doing something about it. Mark crossed his arms, his stance defensive. Oh yeah? What, you finally feeling guilty? Jack sighed. Yes, but not just about the money. About everything. About how Mom and Dad treated us. About how they put me on a pedestal while you and Lisa were always second. Mark's expression flickered, a mix of surprise and something else. Something Jack couldn't quite read. And what, you just realized that now? Jack nodded. I think I didn't want to see it before. I spent my whole life trying to make them proud, trying to live up to their expectations, and I never stopped to think about how that affected you and Lisa. Mark looked away, his jaw tightening. Yeah, well, it's a little late for that. Jack took a deep breath. Maybe. But I want to fix it. Mark turned back to him, skeptical. How? Jack hesitated for only a moment before saying, I want to split the inheritance with you and Lisa. For the first time since the conversation started, Mark looked genuinely shocked. What? I don't want it all, Jack continued. I don't need it all. Mom and Dad made a mistake, and I don't want to be the guy who just benefits from that while you and Lisa are left with nothing. So I'm going to divide it equally. Mark studied him, his expression unreadable. And why should I believe you? Why should I trust that this isn't just some guilt-driven stunt? Jack met his eyes. Because I don't want to lose my family over this. Because I don't want my parents' mistake to define the rest of our lives. And because it's the right thing to do. Mark was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he exhaled, shaking his head. You're serious? I am, Jack said. Mark let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. You know, for a while, I told myself I hated you, he admitted. That I wanted to hate you, because it would have been easier if you had just been some greedy bastard who didn't care. But you're not, are you? Jack shook his head. No. Mark looked at him for a long moment, then finally, his posture relaxed, just a little. You should talk to Lisa, he said. She took this harder than I did. Jack nodded. I will. Mark hesitated, then, in a quieter voice, he said, Thanks. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. Yeah, he said. Me too. That evening, Jack drove to Lisa's house. She lived in a modest neighborhood, her small home surrounded by neatly kept flower beds. He hesitated before knocking, unsure if she would even let him in. When Lisa opened the door, she looked surprised to see him. Then her expression hardened. Can I come in? He asked. Lisa hesitated before stepping aside. I guess. Jack followed her into the living room, where stacks of lesson plans and grading papers covered the coffee table. She had always been dedicated to her students, pouring everything into her work. Lisa crossed her arms. So? What do you want? Jack took a deep breath. I talked to Mark, he said. I told him I want to split the inheritance with both of you. Lisa's eyes widened slightly, but she masked her surprise quickly. You what? I don't want it all, Jack said. I don't even want most of it. It wasn't right for Mom and Dad to give everything to me and nothing to you and Mark. I want to fix it. Lisa stared at him for a long moment. And you think that just giving us money will fix everything? Jack shook his head. No, I know it won't. But it's a start, and I don't want you to think I see myself as more important than you. You and Mark deserve this just as much as I do. Lisa exhaled slowly. I don't even know what to say. Then don't say anything yet, Jack said. Just think about it. And know that I want to fix things, not just with the money, but with us. Lisa studied him, then finally, for the first time in weeks, she gave him a small, tired smile. Okay, she said. We'll see. And for the first time since their parents died, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, his family wasn't lost after all. The weeks following Jack's decision to split the inheritance were filled with difficult conversations, careful planning, and slow but steady steps toward repairing the fractured relationships within his family. Mark and Lisa had both been wary at first, hesitant to believe that Jack's offer was more than just a guilt-driven reaction. But as they saw his commitment to making things right, the walls they had put up began to crack, little by little. Jack had spent a great deal of time speaking with financial advisors and legal professionals to ensure that the transfer of assets was handled properly. While he could technically write a check and hand over the money, he wanted to do things the right way, to make sure his siblings were secure, not just in the immediate future, but in the long run as well. One of the first things he did was visit Lisa again, this time with paperwork in hand. She greeted him at the door with a guarded expression, still unsure how to navigate this new version of their relationship. But she let him in, and they sat at her kitchen table, a stack of documents between them. I wanted to make sure this is done properly, Jack explained. I set up a trust for you. It's not just about giving you a lump sum. It's about making sure you have long-term financial security. You can access the money when you need it, but it'll also grow over time. Lisa looked at him, her expression unreadable. You really thought this through? I did, Jack admitted. I didn't want it to just feel like some handout. You've worked hard your whole life, Lisa. You deserve this. Lisa hesitated, running her fingers over the edge of the papers. It still feels weird, she admitted. I don't want to feel like I'm taking something from you. You're not, Jack said firmly. This was never mine to begin with. Mom and Dad just made a mistake. I'm just correcting it. Lisa exhaled slowly, then nodded. Okay, she said. Thank you. It wasn't an immediate fix, but it was a step in the right direction. With Mark, the conversation was different. Unlike Lisa, who had always been careful and thoughtful with money, Mark had struggled financially in the past. His auto shop had gone through ups and downs, and there had been times when he barely scraped by. When Jack approached him about the money, Mark had been skeptical. I don't need charity, Mark had said, arms crossed. It's not charity, Jack replied. It's what you're owed. Mark had frowned, shaking his head. I don't know, man. I've spent my whole life making do with what I had. The idea of just suddenly having all this money, it doesn't sit right with me. Jack understood. So instead of pushing, he offered a different approach. What if we use some of it to expand the shop, Jack suggested. Invest in it, make it bigger, hire more people. You've built this place up on your own, Mark. Imagine what you could do with real resources. Mark had been silent for a long time before finally exhaling. You really believe in me that much? Jack nodded. Of course I do. That was the moment things shifted between them. As the legal transfers were finalized and the money was officially divided, Jack found himself reflecting on the past few months. What had started as a devastating fracture in his family had, against all odds, turned into something else entirely. One evening, he invited Mark and Lisa over for dinner. It had been years since the three of them had sat down together like this, not as distant siblings, but as a family. At first, the conversation was stilted, small talk about work, the weather, nothing too personal. But as the night went on, the tension eased. Mark cracked a joke about their childhood, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lisa laughed. Jack smiled, realizing how much he had missed them. "You know," Lisa said as she set her glass down, "Mom and Dad would probably be furious if they knew we changed what they wanted." Mark smirked. "Well, maybe they should have thought it through a little better." Jack chuckled. "Maybe. But I think, deep down, they just wanted us to be okay. They just didn't know how to make that happen." Lisa nodded. "Maybe." There was a long pause before Mark raised his glass. "To Grandpa Walter," he said, "because I don't think any of us would be here right now if he hadn't knocked some sense into you." Jack grinned, lifting his own glass. "To Grandpa Walter." Lisa joined in, and for the first time in months, the three of them felt whole again. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds that would take time to heal, but they were moving forward, together.